Good evening. My name's Tom McMahon, and I'm the executive director of the Berean Call. And it's been our privilege, really an excited privilege, to sponsor retired General Shimon Arum. And I'd like to briefly explain why we want you to hear him. First of all, we're greatly concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism that we see taking place around the world today. Prejudice against Jewish people is also growing in the U.S., where increasing numbers see our country's policy of support for Israel as harmful to our national welfare. Sadly, all it seems to take for some people is they're having to spend more money at the gas pump. But in particular, as a Christian ministry, we're concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism among those who profess to be Christians. Not too long ago, as you may know, the Presbyterian Church USA voted to divest their investment funds from companies doing business with Israel. The World Council of Churches followed suit, recommending that their member denominations likewise withdraw investments connected to Israel because of what they erroneously regard as the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. Even among some very influential evangelical Christians, there's a teaching called replacement theology. And basically, if you haven't heard that before, it's a belief that the church has replaced Israel as the chosen people of God. And down through church history, this unbiblical, anti-Jewish doctrine has been the leaven of many evils, the most infamous, of course, being the Holocaust. For those of you not familiar with these things, we have a book out at our table out front titled Judgment Day, Israel, Islam, and the Nations, that provides abundant information and documentation regarding our concerns. We also have a couple of very informative DVDs. One such DVD is Lest We Forget, which is a powerfully moving reminder of the Holocaust. And we have another DVD called Israel, Islam, and Armageddon, which puts anti-Semitism and the recent rise of Islam in biblical perspective. Dave Hunt's book, Judgment Day, by the way, has a strong endorsement from the man it's my privilege to introduce. This is one of the most humble men I have ever met. And I want to give you some biographical information, which he won't tell you, okay? So I'm going to give you some excerpts from it. As a young officer in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army during World War II, he learned firsthand about the horrors of Nazi death camps. What he witnessed changed his life forever. Back home in 1948, just before the establishment of the modern state of Israel, he was chosen by David Ben-Gurion to be on a select group to organize the first official officer school of the Israeli Defense Forces. One of Israel's most decorated military heroes, he led the troops defending against Arab armies that completely surrounded the infant nation. That was on the very day in 1948 that Israel gained United Nations recognition as an independent state. General Arum has fought in virtually every war in the nation's history, including the Sinai Campaign, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. He is past chairman of the Council of Israeli Organizations. He serves or has served on the executive boards of the directors of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Pacific Region, the Zionist Organization of America, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. He's past president of the B'nai B'rith District 4. He's also former chairman of Friends of the Israeli Defense Forces and is founder and president of the Promoting Israel Education Fund and the Israel Christian Nexus. He's dedicated himself to building bridges between Israel and the Jewish and Christian communities, as well as with top government officials here in the U.S. and around the world. Now, one last side note, not found in his biography that I learned from his friends, the Evans. It seems his body contains so much shrapnel from his war experiences that the last place you want to be behind him is going through airport security. Legend has it that he sets off alarms from as far away as the parking lot. Now, that's a legend, and he's going to dismiss that right away, which is the wonderful, gracious, and humble man that he is. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shimon Urim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Before Christmas and New Year, we have always Thanksgiving. And I want to make my Thanksgiving here. You prefer to be here, and I think for a good reason. The reason is that it's beyond Israel. We have a very serious war going on in the world, a war which affects every one of you, affects you as a community. And I mean the war of terrorism and the war of Islamism, which wants to invade the world and control the world. And I will speak on both of them. But before this, let me say a few words about the state of Israel. The Holy Land, as we all know, was a desolated country until the end of the 19th century and until actually the end of World War I, about 80 years ago. Completely desolated. Mark Twain, who visited the Holy Land, said, it's desolated. There's nothing there. In June 1906, there was an article in the National Geographic magazine by a man who used to be ambassador of England, of United Kingdom, who said that he came to the Holy Land. It was a country without population, with the exception of a few cities. And when he speaks about the city of Jerusalem, not the capital, but the city of Jerusalem, he found there 60,000 people. Out of the 60,000 people, 45,000, 3/4 were Jews. 10,000 were Christians, and 5,000 were Muslims. Now, this was under Muslim rule. The Ottoman, the Turks. It was under Muslim rule, not under Jewish rule. How come that in a city that they claim to be the third holiest city to Islam, which is a lie, there are only 5,000 Muslims, barely 10%. They could have had the whole city Muslim, with a minority of Jews and Christians. And yet, it was a majority of Jews in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is ever, in every daily prayer, is a city that the Jews say, we are coming back to Jerusalem. We have been expelled and we are coming back. Moreover, in 1920, the Turks before 1920 tried to bring some people to settle the land. And they thought that 800 people will do the job. They brought 800 people from Iraq, from Morocco, from Albania, to settle the land. It didn't help. And in 1920, the Sheriff of Mecca, Sheriff in Arabic is the person who is in charge of the holy cities, who was deposed by the Saudis, said, there is no way to settle the land but encourage the Jews to do it, because they have the historical connection. That's what an Arab leader has admitted. They have the historical connection. The same year, his son, who became later the first king of Iraq, Faisal, reached an agreement with the president of the Jewish International Zionist Organization. And the agreement said that Israel, the Jews, will control the Holy Land, and we Arabs will control Iraq and Syria. Both of them signed it. The document does exist. You can see it in the British Museum, if they haven't removed it. Signed by both of them. They took a picture in Aqaba after signing it. In short, it was the Arabs who admitted that the Jews have a right to the Holy Land. Not only the Bible, but even those who are on the other side of the Bible, those of the Quran. Not only the people of God, but also the people of the devil. Admitted that it's the Jews who have the right to the Holy Land. Moreover, in 1904, when in the meantime Great Britain has defaulted on its obligation to establish a Jewish homeland in the Holy Land, and the first thing that they have done after this is to cut off 76% of the land and create the Kingdom of Jordan, because they had somehow to compensate the family of the Sheriff Hussein, who supported them in the revolt against, created a kind of an Arab revolt against the Ottomans in World War I. Completely defaulted. They have encouraged Arab immigration into Palestine. They discouraged Jewish immigration into the Holy Land. And problems started to surface in the Holy Land. There were riots. There were riots in 1920. There were riots in 1929. In these riots, the British police did not interfere when in a city like Hebron, the whole Jewish community was slaughtered after being in this city for generations. 4 generations were slaughtered, and with the exception of those few who managed to escape. British police were present, did not interfere. When the Jewish community realized what goes on, in 1934, the leader of the Jewish community, David Ben-Gurion, said, you know, maybe we have to find a solution with the Arabs and talk to them. And he initiated 2 meetings. One meeting was with a man called Musa Alami, who was the Secretary General of the Arab Council. He met with him, and he said, I have a suggestion how to settle it. And the suggestion is the following one. We, the Jews, will rule the Holy Land. Listen to it. We, the Jews, will rule the Holy Land. It will not be divided. It will not have a state which never existed in history, Palestinian. And you, at the same time, will be part of a Semitic federation of the Middle East. And what did Musa Alami said to him? He said to him, Mr. Ben-Gurion, there is something to talk about. He did not reject it in 1934. He did not reject the proposition to establish a Jewish rule with, of course, respect to the minorities there, those who are not Jews. He did not respect it. He said there is something to talk about. And then Mr. Ben-Gurion met with another person, with the leader of the most extreme Arab party, a gentleman by the name of Abdul Hadi. With the extreme Arab party, the name of the party was Independent, in Arabic, Istiklal. And he said to him, gave him the same message. And Mr. Abdul Hadi said, Mr. Ben-Gurion, it's a very interesting proposition, but I suggest that you take it up with our national leader who is in Damascus. His name is Sheikh Arsalan. Let me explain the issue of our national leader. This was a time when the Arab did not wave the flag of Islam, but the flag of nationalism. There was no Islamism. Saudi Arabia, which inflamed all over the world the issue of Islamism, which promotes it all over the world with the money that we pay for gas. In the past, with every $40 on a barrel of oil, which is devoted to change the skyline of all over the world and establish mosques in every nook and corner. This did not exist in the 30s. The issue was Arab nationalism. And indeed, Mr. Ben-Gurion met with Sheikh Arsalan to discuss the issue. And Sheikh Arsalan, and they had one meeting in Geneva that were expected to have another meeting. In the meantime, World War II broke out and political things changed. Now, I've quoted Arab sources. Sharif Hussein was not Jewish, who said what he said. King Faisal was not Jewish. The other leaders that I quoted are Arab leaders. The conclusion is a very simple one. Even the Arabs could not deny the fact that the Holy Land is a Holy Land of the Jewish people. And no one could deny the other fact. And this was not a specific Jew lover, the British ambassador to the United States, that in the majority of people in Jerusalem were Jewish. Because Jerusalem was never, never a capital of any state in the world but a Jewish state. When the Arabs conquered the whole Middle East, they established their center in Damascus. And when they had a center in Palestine, it was a city which is about 15 miles from Tel Aviv, between the coast and Jerusalem, called Ramla. Jerusalem, even under the Arab rule, was never their center. It was Ramla. So much so about the two issues of Jerusalem and who really owns the Holy Land. And this is with the exception of what is stated in the Bible. The third issue, and then I'll come to the emergence of the State of Israel. The third issue is the issue of refugees. The Arab armies in 1948, and rightly so, sent a message to the Arabs. You have to vacate the whole area of the coastal area where Jews are living, because we are going to conquer the place. We are going to use heavy artillery, to use bombardments. It will affect you. Leave it for 2 weeks, and then after we are through, then you will be able to come back, and you will have not only your property back, but also the Jewish property, and the most important thing, the Jewish women. For the Arabs, the issue of women is a very, very important issue. And they were right. They were absolutely right. There was no reason that Israel will prevail in the war of independence. And I'll come to it in a minute. But this was not exactly what happened. There were 80 million Arabs in the surrounding countries, 500,000 Jews, there was an army of about 500,000 Arabs, well-trained, well-equipped, well-armed, facing about 50,000 Jews that not everyone in the 50,000 had a rifle. When I had to send out a patrol, I have to get rifles for the small group of the patrol to go out. They didn't have their own rifles. Where they had a few hundred planes, about 400 planes, facing 4 Jewish planes, 400 facing 4, and the original planes, bombardments was done by opening the window of the 2-engine plane or 1-engine plane that the Israeli had and dropping a grenade. A few hundred tanks facing 3 tanks that the Israeli had, because the British officers who were in charge of these tanks married Jewish women and smuggled out the 3 tanks to face the 400 tanks. And they prevailed. They prevailed. That's ridiculous. You will not find it in any of the annals of wars. 3 tanks facing 400 tanks. Now, no planes. Why did they prevail? For one simple reason: because God wanted them to prevail. Mark Twain says, how come a community of Jewish people, which is less than 0.5% of the total world population, we so hear about them in science, in culture, in literature, and so on. I can't understand it. Couldn't understand it. Again, because this was an act of God. The answer is God. And I say it as a military officer. Yes, I'm proud to say it as a military officer. This was the War of Independence. We learned from the War of Independence 2 military lessons. A, that 2 weapons that we missed, planes and armor, should be the emphasis of our rearmament. But then we also believed, falsely, that with a ceasefire that we signed with the Arab countries in Rhodes, in the Isle of Rhodes, a beginning of era of peace will start. And this was a grave mistake. I said in many occasions that mistakes are being made by politicians. Mistakes are not being made by people of God. You open the Bible, you find every king of Israel and of Judea made mistakes. But you will not find any of the prophets who made a mistake. We had a Cold War because of President Roosevelt. Cold War because of President Roosevelt. We have a problem of Iran and the emergence of international terrorism, Islamic terrorism, because of President Carter. The Iranian, after the sending away the Shah, the Iranian military wanted to take over Iran for the time being, for 1 or 2 years, until they'll be able to conduct free democratic elections. President Carter sent the messengers to them, our deputy commander of the forces in Europe, and said, cooperate with Khomeini. The result is they have beheaded most of the generals, those who didn't escape, and they have established the famous Islamic Republic of Iran that is the chief promoter of terrorism in the world, and we face now the serious matter of the nuclear arm. President Carter realized that he made a very grave mistake. So when the Soviet took over Afghanistan, he decided, this time I'm going to be active. And he started to arm all the people who came to Afghanistan and encourage people to come to Afghanistan and fight the Soviets. The result was the International Organization of Terrorism. And yet, he still has the audacity from time to time to make statements in the world instead of being quiet and hiding himself in a cave. The most powerful country in the world has hostages in Iran and they cannot handle it. The most powerful country in the world, there were more hostages that were taken by Air France to Uganda in 1975, 74, 75. And the Israelis in no time have sent a mission to Uganda, and there were not 16 or 60 hostages. There were more than 100. And they got all of them. United States could not do it. Of course the United States could do it. Of course the Army of the United States could have done it if they had a leader. If they had a leader. God had mercy on us that after 9/11 we don't have Jimmy Carter. So, after the War of Independence, our leader too made a mistake, and I'll explain why they made a mistake. They made a mistake, and they did not insist that the Arab countries who were solidly defeated will sign a peace agreement. Otherwise, we'll pursue them. It was no problem to reach Damascus. It was no problem to reach Cairo, even then. The reason they didn't do it is because they inherited a country with no budget, with nothing. All the money was taken by the British away. They had to feed the population. They had to cope with an increased immigration of Jewish Holocaust survivors. They had to sustain an army. They had to establish an economy. And they thought, we must do it now. We don't have the time to postpone it. And that's the reason a peace agreement was not reached. The result of it is that in 1956, the Egyptian leaders had the audacity to close the shipping line and prevented Israeli ships to cross the Suez Canal. They have nationalized the Suez Canal and announced that no Israeli vessels will pass the Suez Canal. The Israelis decided to respond. And in this case, they had two allies which also rejected this nationalism. This is France and England. And there was a campaign. In this campaign, the Egyptians were solidly defeated, but still the Israelis had to retreat. And this retreat has harbored the next terrible war, the Six-Day War. And I remember this war very vividly. First of all, the balance of power. The Arabs mobilized 400,000 people. The Israelis had under arms about 250,000 people. The Arabs had 2,000 tanks. The Israeli had 1,000 tanks. The Arabs had about 1,600 artillery pieces. The Israeli had 300 artillery pieces. The Arabs had 800 planes. The Israeli had 350. It was a very serious matter. The army was mobilized after Egypt declared that they are going to launch a campaign and erase Israel from the map. The army was mobilized, but the political leadership was not in a rush to start any preemptive war against the Arab states. They were not in a rush because there were specific promises of the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of England that if the southern part of Israel, called the Straits of Tiran, will be closed, and if the Egyptians will again populate the Sinai Desert, they were not the Sinai Desert, they were United States people in the Sinai Desert, then it is a cause for war. The Egyptians demanded from the United Nations, or rather I call them United Nothing, to vacate the Sinai Desert, and they did so. They vacated, and they stuck to their guns, not enabling any Israeli ships to reach the harbors in south of Israel. But even Israel's Secretary of State met with President Johnson. President Johnson said to him, we are trying to do something, but the trying to do something lasted too long, and Israeli military asked for a meeting with the leaders of the government. I was not looking forward for this kind of mission, but the Chief of Staff of the Israeli army asked me to be the spokesman. And this is what I said to the Prime Minister of Israel. Mr. Prime Minister, you know very well that we don't have oil to operate our tanks beyond 8 days. If we don't initiate a war now, and the Arabs start it, it will be a long war. Our tanks will not be able to move. Mr. Prime Minister, you are aware of the fact that we have mobilized about 250,000 people. The economy of Israel is at standstill. If we don't initiate a war and finish it quickly, there will be a traumatic collapse of the Israeli economy. And the last thing, Mr. Prime Minister, I have just visited my troops, and I'm telling you, we are the last stretch of preventing demoralization. They cannot be armed and do nothing. Mr. Prime Minister, I ask you to have an immediate declaration that will enable us to start a war. The government decided, the meeting was the end of May, the government decided to have our war, to initiate our war on the 4th of June. on the 3rd of June, the Jordanian intelligence somehow managed to get the information that we will start a war on June 4th. All the Arab army were at alert. Air forces, armor, everything was at alert. Fortunately, not because we were aware of the intelligence slip, we decided to start a war on the 5th. When the Arabs saw that on the 4th there is no war, they came to the conclusion that this was a false alarm and they were relaxed. And we enjoy the fact that they relaxed. Within 3 hours, we wiped out 25 airfields of the Arab countries. On the first day, there was no more Syrian Air Force, an Egyptian Air Force, and barely a Jordanian Air Force within the first day. And now, hear what transpired on the Arab side. They were stunned, of course, but the Jordanian were still out of the game. So here is a wireless discussion of the president of Egypt, Abdul Nasser, with the king of Jordan. And I almost quoted. He said, "We have annihilated the whole Israeli Air Force." His Air Force was in shambles. Annihilated the whole Israeli Air Force. It is your last chance to join us. Why do I quote it? We have to get used to the fact, and I say it clearly. When an Arab opens his mouth, it's a lie. Even the president of Egypt, when he speaks to the king of Jordan, even he lies. You know why President Bush refused to meet with Arafat? Because he was not used to it. Arafat lied to him on the phone. A grave lie. And he decided he's not going to meet with liars. How could this happen? How could this happen? Simple reason. Israel did not fight alone. Israel fought with the help of God. To give you perhaps a more striking example from the War of Independence. When the Egyptian army marched into the Holy Land, they came at the first obstacle, and the obstacle was a small collective settlement with 150 people there. Out of the 150 people, 80 were farmers of the settlement, 70 were people of the Israeli army. 150 people. The force of the Egyptian facing the 150 people was 2,500. And the 150 people have kept the 2,500 not 6 hours until they'll take over, not 6 days, not 6 weeks, but months. Months. 150 people, out of them 70 people who were armed, against 2,500. There is no explanation but the miracle of God. I can give you examples like this from here to Timbuktu. I was a battalion commander, the War of Independence, and they asked me to take over a position which was surrounded by the Egyptian on three sides. Only on one side was connected to Israel. I decided that under circumstances like this, I have to be there, in spite of the fact that only part of my forces were there in the enclave. I have to be with them. I cannot send someone. We were 200 people in this enclave, surrounded by about 2,000 Egyptians from three sides. On day 20th, I had out of the 200 people, only 20 people who were able to mount the positions around the enclave. 180 people, most of them were wounded. I was wounded, but I was fed by painkillers, injections. I have a medic who gave me every few hours. Some of them died. I woke up the 10 people. It was already a shift of 12 hours, 10 and 10. 10 people. We have done the routine thing of Joshua bin Nun, went around the post and fired and fired and fired to create an impression that it's a big force there. We had ammunition, luckily. And then at 8 o'clock, when we expected, at night the Egyptians don't fight. At 8 o'clock, when we expected the Egyptians to surround us, there were no Egyptians anymore. They lost the hope that they'll take over. And cases like this were abound. So the question is, what's now? And what's now affects not only Israel, but affects you. It affects you because the war of terrorism did not start when Israel was established. There's a book by an American admiral who describes how every Sunday Muslims in the Philippines come to the marketplace and kill Christians. And this was done before anyone dreamt that the state of Israel would be established. And the war of terror affects every one of us. But there's a war which is connected with it. And this is the takeover of Europe as the first stage. And let me give you some example of what goes on in Europe. England. Burger King serves not only hamburgers, which my grandson loved to eat, but also ice cream. And they serve it through the machines, you know, of the yogurt machine ice cream, with a kind of a swirl on top. The Muslims came to Burger King and said to them, you cannot have this swirl because it insults us. It reminds a letter in the Quran. And Burger King yielded. They are not the majority in England, but they yielded. The Red Cross. The Red Cross has displayed nativity scenery in England. They displayed also Christmas trees. And the Muslims came over and they say, it insults us. And the Red Cross has eliminated the nativity scenes and the Christmas trees. The Islamic paper, and you can get it from a source called Memory, which translates all the Islamic media, most of the Islamic media, is publishing horrendous caricatures, horrendous cartoons. But a Danish paper has published some cartoons, and no one paid attention to it in Europe until a group of preachers, imams, a group of imams went a year later to the Middle East to show these cartoons and forged other most insulting cartoons and showed it to the leaders, etc., in the Arab world, and all hell broke out. And the result? They demanded from the largest chain of supermarket in Germany not to accommodate Danish products on its shelves, and the supermarket yielded. These are just a few of examples of what goes on in Europe. The third largest city in Sweden, Malmö, has a considerable number of Arabs. So much so that Swedes start to leave the city. Swedes start to leave the city. Oslo, after populating Bergen, which is the second largest city in Norway, they decided to do the same in Oslo. It will not end with Europe if it will go on like this. It will come to the United States. Because in the meetings that they had, they zeroed in on the United States. Before 9/11, especially before 9/11, but also after 9/11. I don't want to quote it because this will draw their attention to the meetings that we were able to know what goes on there. They specifically said, we, the Muslims, have to bring here young people, college age. Now, people ask me, why is this happening in Europe? And there's only one explanation. The explanation is that the soil was prepared by ultra-liberal organization in Europe. The accommodation of these Muslim people were prepared in advance. And someone asked me, and what about the leadership? Well, here I have to tell you a story which there was a king, and the king wanted to go hunting. So he called his prime minister and said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, will I have a nice weather like in Bend, Oregon, so I can go hunting? And the Prime Minister said, yes, my king, absolutely. The king took his horse with a group of people following him, and after about half an hour they passed a farm, and a farmer was standing there with his jackass, and the farmer asked the king, where are you going, my king? And he said, oh, I'm going hunting. The farmer said, oh, don't. It's going to be a terrible rain. The king said, no rain. The prime minister promised me. Well, within 15 minutes, it was raining cats and dogs. The king was angry. He rushed back to the palace, asked to bring the farmer to the palace. The farmer came to the palace and he asked him, how did you know? And the farmer said, well, every time there's going to be rain, my jackass pops his ears. The king fired his prime minister and appointed his jackass, the jackass, to be a prime minister. Well, the terrible thing is that all the rest of the jackasses envied this jackass, and they became prime ministers in Europe. When you have a continent with jackasses who are prime minister, these are the results. So you ask a right question. How can we protect ourselves? And I think that the answer lies in what the Israelis have done when they have responded to Entebbe, the case of the hijacking of the plane to Entebbe. Number one, when it comes to terrorism, you respond immediately. You don't let 252 Marines in Lebanon being killed by the Hezbollah and do nothing because a man by the name of Kasper Weinberger said, oh, this will enrage our Saudi friends if we are going to do something. They kill Americans and you don't respond? Never heard such a thing. You respond to terrorist activities immediately. And therefore, in spite of the fact of all the efforts that they are doing now in Israel, they are not very successful. Most of the cases are aborted by the Israelis. More than 90% of the cases. You respond. Number two, you cannot respond properly if you don't have intelligence. And intelligence is not intelligence from the sky, but it's human intelligence. And with the same President Carter, who gave back the Panama Canal without reason, gave the first instruction to his appointed head of the CIA, we should cut the budget of the CIA. We don't need personal intelligence. What we have in the sky is enough. You cannot develop personal intelligence in 1 year or in 2 years. It takes between 5 to 10 years. And I'm giving you information from my experience. 5 to 10 years. Number three, you have to have in advance a well-trained special unit to deal with it. After 1948, in the early 50s, one of the other things that the Israeli army has done is establish a special group of people, a commando unit, which later became also the paratroopers. The paratrooper commando unit, headed by a man that his name became famous later, Arik Sharon, to deal with cases like this. So when we had Entebbe, we had the commando unit ready to do it. We had the intelligence already, which we start getting, that the Bader-Meinhof was a German terrorist group which hijacked it, was visiting Entebbe too often. And we had already starting a file in Entebbe, in case something will happen. We had already the plan of the airport there, in case something will happen. It's a file on the shelf, but it became very useful. So you have to have a unit to do it. And when you have a good unit to do it, then you can release the American hostages from Iran. And the most important thing, you have to have the will to do it. And you can have the will to do it if you have the leadership. Leadership is the key. Leadership is the key. And the duty of leadership, first and foremost, is to make sure that you are safe. That's their first duty. To make sure that your children will not encounter anything when they go to a club. That the women will not have anything when they go to the shopping mall. This is the first duty of leadership, to make sure that you are safe, every single one of you who sits here. And your first loyalty after your loyalty of faith, your first loyalty, and I dare say it even before your loyalty to this country, is your loyalty to your family. This directs everything. Leadership to make sure that you are safe. Now, this cannot be done by talk, only by actions. And James, chapter 2, the last verse, said it very clearly. Faith is dead without action. It says without work, but the work, action, when they translated in King James' time, was not yet there. The real translation of the Greek word is action. Faith without action is dead. And I'm telling you, the answer is in your hand. Thank you.